The hidden algorithm behind social collapse. Turchin's mathematical cycles of history. Civilizations don't randomly collapse. They follow a mathematical pattern so precise you could set your watch to it. Look at America right now. Political polarization at historic highs. Wealth inequality surpassing Gilded Age levels. Social cohesion fracturing before our eyes. Now look at the French Revolution, the fall of Rome, the collapse of the Han Dynasty. The similarities aren't coincidental. They're algorithmic. What if I told you that a biologist turned historian has discovered an equation that predicts when societies will fracture? That we can calculate the exact pressure points where cooperation breaks down and chaos emerges? That we're witnessing, in real time, the same mathematical forces that have toppled empires for thousands of years? Before we continue, if you enjoy unraveling hidden truths and uncovering the forces that shape our world, make sure to click that subscribe button. Your support allows us to continue bringing you the insights that truly challenge how we think. Now let's go deeper. For centuries, historians viewed social collapse as unique events, each with their own causes, contexts, and consequences. The fall of Rome, barbarian invasions and internal corruption. The Russian Revolution, war exhaustion and economic misery under an out-of-touch aristocracy. The Arab Spring, oppression, youth unemployment, and soaring food prices. We've been looking at each tree, missing the mathematical forest that connects them all. Enter Peter Turchin, a scientist who abandoned studying beetle populations to decode human history instead. His revolutionary approach, cliodynamics, applies mathematical rigor to historical patterns. What he discovered should disturb you. Societies don't evolve randomly. They cycle through predictable patterns of growth, inequality, instability, and collapse with almost clockwork precision. The most alarming cycle Turchin identified spans roughly 50 years, 2 generations. This fathers and sons cycle reveals how prosperity paradoxically sows the seeds of its own destruction. Let me walk you through how this hidden algorithm unfolds, step by mathematical step. It begins with cooperation, what historians call a period of integration. Picture America after World War II. The existential threat created unprecedented unity. The economy boomed. Government invested massively in infrastructure and education. Labor unions were strong. Income inequality decreased. Trust in institutions reached historic highs. This integration phase isn't just felt economically. It manifests as social cohesion, a shared narrative, a collective purpose. Look at the numbers. In 1945, nearly 75% of Americans trusted their government to do the right thing. Economic growth averaged over 4% annually for 2 decades. The middle class expanded dramatically, with a single income sufficient to support an entire family. The GI Bill sent millions to college who never would have gone before. This wasn't just American exceptionalism. Similar patterns emerged in post-war Japan, Germany, and across Western Europe. The mathematics of cooperation were working, but here's where the algorithm takes its first dark turn. Success creates competition. As resources become abundant, people fight harder for relative status rather than survival. The generation born into prosperity doesn't experience the unifying threat their parents faced. They take stability for granted. The mathematical result? Cooperation begins to unravel. The elite population starts to expand dramatically. When societies prosper, more people can access education and opportunity. In America's case, college graduation rates skyrocketed after the 1950s. In 1950, only 6% of Americans had a 4-year college degree. By 2020, that number exceeded 35%. But here's the brutal equation. The number of elite positions, congressional seats, CEO roles, prestigious professorships, remains relatively fixed. Suddenly, many more capable people compete for the same limited slots. This creates what Turchin calls elite overproduction. Too many qualified people for too few positions of power and status. The mathematics are unforgiving. When supply exceeds demand, the value crashes. In human terms, this means elites start fighting each other more intensely. Political polarization increases. Compromise becomes weakness. Extreme positions become necessary to stand out in the crowded field. Consider the legal profession. America now produces about 40,000 law school graduates annually, competing for far fewer prestigious positions. In the 1950s, a law degree virtually guaranteed upper-middle-class status. Today, it often leads to massive debt without corresponding opportunity. The same pattern repeats across fields: academia, finance, medicine, even the arts. Elite credentials have simultaneously become more necessary and less sufficient for success. Meanwhile, the costs of maintaining status skyrocket. Take elite education. Harvard's tuition in 1950 would cost about $5,000 in today's dollars. Now, is over $50,000. Parents spend small fortunes on test prep, extracurriculars, and private schools, just to maintain their children's competitive edge. In affluent neighborhoods, childhood itself has been transformed into a status competition, with parents spending over $10,000 annually per child on enrichment activities. The result is a society where status becomes increasingly expensive and increasingly important. Now watch how the algorithm escalates. As elite competition intensifies, the winners naturally consolidate their gains. They change roles to protect their advantages. Tax codes shift to favor capital over labor. Regulatory agencies become captured by the industries they oversee. Political systems become responsive to donors, not voters. Politicians increasingly come from the same elite schools, the same professional backgrounds, the same wealthy families. The numbers tell the story. In 1950, corporate CEOs earned about 20 times the average worker's salary. Today, they earn over 350 times as much. The top marginal tax rate has fallen from over 90% to under 40%. Financial deregulation has allowed massive wealth concentration. Inheritance laws have been relaxed, enabling dynastic wealth accumulation. These aren't random changes, they're mathematical responses to increased elite competition. As winners pull up the ladder behind them, this is where wealth inequality enters the equation. In every cycle Turchin studied, from ancient Rome to medieval China to pre-revolutionary France, the same pattern emerges. Wealth concentrates dramatically just before collapse. The numbers from America tell the story. The share of wealth owned by the top 0.1% has returned to levels not seen since the 1920s, right before the Great Depression. The bottom 50% of Americans own just 2% of the nation's wealth, while the top 1% own more than the entire middle class combined. But inequality alone doesn't trigger collapse. The key variable is what Turchin calls elite betrayal. When elites shift from seeing themselves as stewards of society to seeing society as a resource to exploit, the social contract fractures. Public institutions that once inspired trust become extraction mechanisms. Healthcare, education, housing, all become increasingly unaffordable as elites extract more value while providing less in return. Look at how this manifests. College tuition has increased at twice the rate of inflation for decades. Healthcare costs have exploded while outcomes have stagnated. Housing in opportunity-rich areas has become unaffordable for most. These trends aren't accidents, they're mathematical consequences of elite competition. As successful elites convert their advantages into extractive systems, the mathematics of social cohesion break down further when the younger generation realizes the game is rigged. When hard work, education, and playing by the rules no longer guarantee security, much less advancement, people lose faith in the system itself. This disillusionment creates a pool of educated, frustrated young people who become what Turchin calls counter-elites, leaders who gain power by challenging the very legitimacy of the established order. These counter-elites play a crucial role in Turchin's equation. Rather than working within the system, they mobilize popular resentment against it. They frame societal problems not as technical challenges to be solved, but as moral failures to be condemned. They reject incremental reform in favor of systemic transformation. And critically, they find ready followers among the disillusioned masses who feel the system has failed them. Let's look at the equation in action. In pre-revolutionary France, aristocrats had multiplied while avoiding taxes, forcing common people to shoulder crushing financial burdens. A new class of educated bourgeoisie found themselves blocked from advancement by an entrenched nobility. The result? The French Revolution, led not by the peasantry but by these frustrated counter-elites, figures like Robespierre and Danton, who channeled popular rage toward revolutionary ends. In late Republican Rome, wealthy patricians monopolized land while returning war veterans found themselves landless and indebted. A new class of populist leaders, the Gracchi brothers, Marius, and ultimately Caesar, emerged to champion their cause against the established Senate elite. The result? The collapse of the Republic and rise of authoritarian emperors. The Russian Revolution followed a similar pattern. An ossified aristocracy, a rapidly expanding educated class with limited opportunities, and crushing inequality. Lenin and the Bolsheviks, educated counter-elites themselves, mobilized popular discontent to overthrow the entire system. And today, the United States has more lawyers, MBAs, and PhDs than ever before, competing for status in a winner-take-all economy where the top 1% have captured nearly all gains since the 1980s. College graduates work as baristas while carrying crushing student debt. Housing costs have disconnected entirely from incomes. Political polarization has reached levels not seen since the Civil War. Most disturbing of all, Americans' trust in institutions has collapsed. In the 1960s, over 70% trusted the government to do the right thing. Today, that figure hovers around 20%. Trust in media, religion, academia, and business has similarly plummeted. This institutional mistrust is the oxygen that feeds the fire of social breakdown, and it follows directly from the mathematics of elite betrayal. But here's where Turchin's mathematical model becomes truly unsettling. He doesn't just explain the past, he predicts the future. In 2010, he forecasted that America would experience peak instability around 2020. His paper, published a decade before the pandemic, before the contested election, before the Capitol riot, precisely anticipated when social cohesion would reach its breaking point. How could he know? Because the algorithm doesn't care about personalities or specific events. It operates on deeper structural forces, the mathematics of cooperation and competition, the cold equations of inequality and elite overproduction. Different triggers might set events in motion: a pandemic, an election, an economic crisis. But the underlying pressures make instability mathematically inevitable. Turchin's model also identifies a longer cycle, spanning about 150 to 200 years, that compounds the generational cycle. These secular cycles move from integration to disintegration over multiple generations. He calls the disintegrative phase an age of discord, marked by political polarization, institutional mistrust, economic stagnation for ordinary people, and epidemic levels of political violence. The last American age of discord peaked in the 1860s with the Civil War. Before that, the revolutionary period of the 1770s marked another peak. Following the pattern, we're now entering another disintegrative peak, right on schedule. Similar cycles appear in Chinese history, where major rebellions and dynasty changes occur with remarkable mathematical regularity every 2 centuries. This forces us to confront an uncomfortable question. If social collapse follows predictable mathematical patterns, is our fate already written in the equations? Are we simply actors in a predetermined script, playing out the same drama that has repeated throughout history? What makes this question especially disturbing is how these cycles accelerate with technology. Information now spreads instantaneously. Markets react in milliseconds. Social movements form and mobilize in days rather than years. The feedback loops that once took decades now unfold in months or years. The mathematical forces that Turchin identified haven't changed, but their velocity has increased dramatically. Yet Turchin's models reveal something even more profound. These cycles aren't driven by impersonal forces like technology or geography. They're driven by choices, specifically the choices of elites. When elites choose extraction over stewardship, when they prioritize short-term gain over long-term stability, when they retreat into bubbles of privilege rather than addressing structural problems, they accelerate the mathematical progression toward collapse. The data confirms this. Societies where elites voluntarily restrain their advantages through progressive taxation, inheritance limitations, or strong labor institutions experience longer periods of stability and broader prosperity. Nordic countries, with their high taxes, strong social safety nets, and compressed income distributions, have maintained remarkably stable political systems despite undergoing the same technological and economic changes as more unequal societies. This brings us to the most shocking insight of all. Collapse isn't inevitable. The mathematics of history don't dictate outcomes. They reveal pressures, and pressures can be countered through conscious intervention. The equation has variables we can control. Societies that have extended their integration phases share common features. They find ways to moderate elite competition, maintain reasonable wealth distribution, and most importantly, sustain a shared narrative that binds different segments of society together. The most successful civilizations don't avoid the mathematical pressures, they manage them. Look at how America navigated potential collapse in the early 20th century. Facing extreme inequality, labor unrest, and elite capture of government, the country implemented progressive reforms. The Sherman Antitrust Act broke up monopolies. The income tax and estate tax prevented dynasty formation. Labor laws protected workers' rights to organize. Public education expanded opportunity. These reforms didn't happen spontaneously. They were conscious responses to the mathematical pressures that Turchin's models identify. Similar reform periods occurred in Britain during the Victorian era and in continental Europe after World War II. By recognizing the danger signs and implementing reforms that reduced inequality and elite dominance, these societies extended their integration phases and avoided the worst outcomes predicted by the mathematical cycles. The algorithm behind social collapse isn't deterministic, it's probabilistic. It doesn't dictate our fate, it maps the forces shaping it. Understanding these forces gives us the power to redirect them, but this understanding comes with enormous responsibility. We now know the warning signs, we can measure the pressure points, we can see with mathematical precision how choices made by those in power ripple through society, either reinforcing cohesion or accelerating collapse. So what does Turchin's model suggest for addressing our current crisis? Several interventions emerge directly from the mathematics. First, addressing elite overproduction requires creating more constructive outlets for elite ambitions. When too many elites compete for too few slots, society can either increase the number of meaningful positions or decrease the production of elites. The former approach, expanding opportunity, typically yields better outcomes than restricting education or mobility. Second, reducing inequality, particularly wealth inequality, is mathematically essential for stability. Progressive taxation, inheritance taxes, and strong labor institutions all serve to prevent the extreme concentration of wealth that precedes collapse in Turchin's models. These aren't ideological preferences but mathematical necessities for social cohesion. Third, rebuilding institutional trust requires elite recommitment to stewardship rather than extraction. When elites prioritize societal well-being over personal gain, when they demonstrate genuine concern for those outside their class, institutional trust can be restored. This requires more than rhetoric. It demands concrete sacrifices of privilege and advantage. Fourth, fostering a shared national narrative that transcends political, cultural, and economic divisions can counteract the fragmentation that precedes collapse. Successful societies maintain myths, symbols, and values that unite people across different segments of society, creating a sense of common destiny despite differences. But perhaps most importantly, Turchin's mathematics suggest that elite responsibility is the key variable. When elites recognize the danger signals and implement reforms voluntarily, societies can navigate these treacherous cycles without revolution or disintegration. When they resist change, clinging to advantages even as society crumbles around them, the mathematics of collapse become nearly inexorable. So what does Turchin's model predict for our future? The mathematics suggest we're entering a period of peak instability that typically lasts 10 to 15 years. These periods have historically taken one of three paths: reform, revolution, or disintegration. Reform occurs when elites recognize the dangers and implement meaningful changes, as happened during the Progressive Era. Revolution occurs when elites resist change until counter-elites mobilize popular support to overthrow them, as in France or Russia. Disintegration occurs when society fractures into competing regions or factions, as happened to many ancient empires. Which path we take depends largely on elite response. Will today's elites recognize the mathematical patterns and implement reforms to reduce inequality, expand opportunity, and rebuild social cohesion? Or will they retreat behind walls of privilege, using increasingly authoritarian methods to maintain their position as society crumbles around them. History provides examples of both choices and their consequences. The British aristocracy gradually ceded power through electoral reforms, avoiding revolution. The Roman senatorial class eventually adapted to share power with equestrians and provincial elites, extending the empire's lifespan. The Chinese imperial system repeatedly renewed itself through dynastic change, each new dynasty implementing reforms before hardening into the same patterns that doomed its predecessor. Conversely, the French aristocracy resisted change until it was violently overthrown. The Russian aristocracy clung to power until revolutions swept them away entirely. The late Byzantine elites fought each other for larger slices of a shrinking pie until the empire collapsed beneath them. What makes our moment unique is that we now understand the mathematics at work. Previous societies experienced these cycles blindly, responding to symptoms without comprehending the underlying algorithm. We have the advantage of seeing the pattern, of knowing where we stand in the cycle and what interventions might alter its course. This knowledge creates both opportunity and responsibility. The opportunity lies in our potential to consciously navigate these treacherous waters, to make choices that bend the mathematical curve away from collapse and toward renewal. The responsibility lies in recognizing that an action is also a choice, one that allows the algorithm to run its course toward potentially catastrophic outcomes. As we stand at this critical juncture, Turchin's mathematical lens offers not just warning but clarity. The hidden algorithm of collapse isn't mystical or metaphorical, it's measurable. The cycles that have shaped human civilization for millennia are now unfolding in our lifetimes, accelerated by technology but following the same mathematical principles that have always governed human cooperation and competition. Understanding these principles gives us agency. We are doomed to repeat the cycles of the past. By recognizing the pressures, by measuring the warning signs, by making conscious choices to counter the mathematical forces pulling society apart, we can potentially navigate the dangerous waters ahead. This is what makes Turchin's work simultaneously terrifying and empowering. The mathematics of history reveal our vulnerabilities, but they also illuminate our choices. The algorithm doesn't control us. It simply maps the consequences of our collective decisions. Look at the warning signs around us. A record 79% of Americans believe the country is heading in the wrong direction. Political violence has increased tenfold in the past decade. Nearly 60% of young Americans believe democracy is in trouble or failing. Income growth for the bottom 50% has stagnated for decades, while the top 1% have seen their wealth triple. These aren't random statistics. They're mathematical indicators of a society approaching a breaking point. Yet simultaneously, we see countervailing forces emerging. Renewed labor organizing, bipartisan concern about monopoly power, growing elite awareness of systemic risks, and grassroots movements seeking to bridge political divides. These forces suggest that at least some segments of society recognize the danger and are working to alter the trajectory. So as we witness the fracturing of institutions, the polarization of discourse, the concentration of wealth, and the production of elites that Turchin's models predicted, we face a profound choice. Will we be passive participants in a mathematical cycle that has repeated throughout history? Or will we use this understanding to write a different equation, one that leads not to collapse but to renewal? The algorithm of history is running. The mathematics of social cohesion are under unprecedented strain. The variables that determine whether we experience reform, revolution, or disintegration are now in play. But unlike our ancestors, we can see the code. We understand the equation. We know which variables matter most. This knowledge doesn't guarantee a better outcome, but it offers something previous generations lacked: the possibility of conscious intervention in a process that has blindly shaped human civilization for millennia. Understanding the hidden algorithm behind social collapse may be our best hope of avoiding it. If this exploration of history's hidden patterns has made you think, challenged your assumptions, and sparked a deeper curiosity about the forces shaping our world, then make sure to subscribe. Don't forget to hit the like button and share this video with those who need to hear this truth, because understanding the algorithm is the first step toward changing the outcome.